Hello, everybody. Good to have you here for another deadline week. And so 2 weeks from now will be the floor deadline week, which so now for the next 2 weeks we'll exclusively be doing work on legislation on the House floor. Now we certainly still have one committee in particular that's still meeting, the investigative committee chaired by Majority Leader Mark Lawson on mental health. They'll be conducting their second hearing this afternoon. As you all know, we took the unusual step the legislature doesn't often do of having folks that come and testify before the committee go under oath before they testify. And so this is just, we're getting inconsistent information and hearing different information. And so just to make sure the information that we're receiving is consistent and accurate. And there was a lot of good information, I felt like, in the previous hearing. The commissioner, she deferred to the CFO, Skip Leonard, time and time again when it came to many of the budget issues last week. So today in the hearing, Mr. Leonard will be testifying, scheduled to testify, and we'll be hearing from him. So I would not be surprised if his testimony and Q&A period lasts just as long, if not longer, than what there was for the commissioner, because a lot of the questions are fiscal in nature. And so there are a lot of things that have come up to investigate with the committee, a lot of policy matters, but of course the most pressing matter, which I have repeated to the members of the committee, is the budget side of things, because at the end of the day we have one constitutional duty as a legislature that we must get done, and that is to pass a budget. And so we don't have a ton of time left in the legislative session to conduct the budget, so we need to figure out how much money the agency needs. One of the things that I'm curious about as we conduct this hearing today in particular is the fact that they've stated that they're $43 million short on paying their bills for this year. However, they're enacting bridge contracts as of May 10th, and the current payments are going to continue beyond May 10th, and yet they're only asking for $6.2 million to finish the fiscal year, and $6.2 million does not equal $43 million. So we're trying to determine how does that math work out, and if that's the case, that's great. By all means, we would love to appropriate fewer taxpayer dollars if $6.2 million is sufficient. We just want to be very confident in that we're not going to be in the same boat by the time we roll around in the next legislative session, that potentially the agency is short again. So those are some things we're digging in at the House. We know some great House priorities have continued to advance in the Senate on the teacher rehire bill, on retired teachers, the extension of the step schedule for teachers from 25 to 35 years advanced out of their committees as well. What we call the Chevron deference bill is over in the Senate and eligible to be heard on the floor as well. So a lot of great bills that advanced over on the Senate side that we've worked on, and over the next few weeks we're going to try to hammer out a budget and continue to figure out what bills we're going to ultimately send to the governor's desk. So happy to take questions on what you guys have.
Yeah, if we can stay on mental health briefly, I don't know if you have seen it, so don't make your answer necessarily totally tied to this report, but Healthy Minds Policy Initiative put out a report looking at CCBHCs. Some of the language is a little vague. It basically calls for more regulations. I'm not really sure exactly what or by whom. I didn't know till the other day that the state actually operates 4 of the CCBHCs. So we have this model where there's, a couple dozen nonprofits that have this model, and then the state actually internally operates 4 of these. And it seems like the regulations are a mess and very complicated. Have you had a chance to, or has anybody in your caucus had a chance to really dig into that, look at that, and wonder, is that where a lot of this money is going, and how is that being spent?
I mean, that's certainly an integral piece of the conversation moving forward on the investigation, because that's a big part of it, is our partners in the mental health space for the providers. And you referenced Healthy Minds. I mean, their director, Zach Stoikoff, has been very helpful as well over the years in digging into mental health related issues. It's fascinating. I may have mentioned this earlier on in session, press availability. I know I mentioned it in caucus, if not publicly, but one of my goals as speaker coming in was on mental health. I wanted in the year 2025 for us to put a plan together on how to address mental health. And so as a caucus, we kind of just 2025, we're probably not going to talk about mental health very much, and then we're going to come in 2026 with a plan. But unfortunately, that's just not how it worked out. And maybe that's for the best, because we do have some pressing issues we need to address. So in some ways, the crisis is a good thing in the sense that it's forced us to come to the table and talk a little sooner. But one of the things we've been wanting to do is address a long-term plan on mental health. What does it look like? CCBHCs, you name it. And one of the things that I've visited with Mr. Stoikoff about in Healthy Minds is, hey, help us come together with a plan on mental health of when there's a crisis scenario today in rural Oklahoma with a minor, what happens today? And I understand you've seen one situation, but in general, what happens? And then what should happen? You have the same situation in a metro. What happens today and what should happen? The same thing on adults. What typically happens and what should happen. And just show it on a one-page sheet where somebody who's not a mental health expert can look at it and say, okay, here's the gap, here's the shortfall, here's where we need to get to. And so I know that conversation as a whole of the mental health system is probably beyond the scope of what the investigative committee is looking into this session, but I know that's beyond the scope of your question as well, but that's really what we're looking into is how can we come in the 60th legislature, whether it's all addressed this year or next year, to have a long-term plan on where we get on mental health. I thought the testimony from District Attorney Kunzweiler was very compelling, where he said that in his view, the mental health system in the late 80s and early 90s in the state of Oklahoma was better than it is today. That is incredibly concerning, and I would contend that he is somebody who's well versed in this space and is someone that we should listen to.
Shift a little bit to the social studies standards. My colleague is at the meeting right now, and the 3 new board members have said that they were not informed of the changes made before voting on them, and I'm curious, are you comfortable moving forward with these standards, knowing that 3 members who voted on them didn't know what was in the standards themselves?
So there have been statements that have been made. I hope that wasn't me. There have been statements that have been made earlier this week that the documents that were received by the board are different from what they actually voted on. Well, I actually ran into the state superintendent last night before an event started, and he informed me that that is not true, and he sent us the documentation and proof of that. And in fact, last night and this morning, we looked through that, and so I've got in front of me a copy of what the board members received, copy of what we received that they finally voted on, and as far as we can tell, everything's identical.
You said voted on them?
Yes.
You voted on them on the floor?
No.
Okay. Sorry, I thought you meant you
That
voted
the
on
board voted on, and versus what we received from the State Department of Education, because one of the claims was that it was different, and I mean, we've looked through it and they look identical. Now these are long documents, so you know, if we miss something, we miss it, but we vetted it pretty heavily, and we cannot find distinction between what the board received and what was ultimately voted on. So it does seem some of the conversation of the past couple of weeks has shifted from the content of the standards to the process of the standards. And so there may be some other complaints about process, but as far as the claim that the board received different documents that they ultimately voted on, as far as we can tell, that does not appear to be the case.
I think that at least the initial concern that we reported was that there was no presentation of here's what changed, right? This has been posted publicly for a couple months. Here's what we had a presentation over. Here's all that. Now here is a 400-page document. This is what we're voting on Tuesday or Thursday. Is different than here's what changed from the 2 months where everybody in the whole state got to review it to here's what we're asking you to vote on Thursday.
Sure.
And I think at least the board members we talked to initially, I can't speak to what they've said now.
Yeah.
Said it felt like an omission of information, not
Sure.
so much necessarily, bait switch, but just
Right.
like we didn't get told.
Sure, and I would say that would be conversation with the board members. I mean, I was not in the room for their conversations with, the state superintendent and staff. I mean, all I can go off of is what they sent us that they sent the board, and at least in that front, it looks like the documentation is the same from what we can see. Now, if there were inconsistencies on what they were told, that would be questions for them. I wasn't in the room.
Well, and the public was never shown any of it. I mean, it was not publicly available, which I think is weird if you're going to have public hearings about what should be in there and then posting.
Well, I know in our legislative.
You used to be on the board.
They would have to, if it was on a board agenda, that whole packet is available publicly.
Not until after the board meeting, typically, I don't
But
think.
it would be,
But like ahead of the meeting occurring, there's not like a link
No.
on the agenda. There's not a link on the website.
no, but the board packet, the full board packet would be available that day when the board meetings happen.
But like where?
On their website. It's available.
Not anymore.
Yeah, I don't think.
Like,
Seriously.
I was on it.
Not anymore.
Interesting.
Oftentimes there are items on which they vote that we don't see until days later.
And to ask
And this
after.
was one of those,
Yeah. So again, if that's a new complaint to my ears, it's maybe been circulating before, but I just hadn't heard about it. That the latest issue that I had heard, and that the state superintendent personally came and talked to me last night about, was he said it is not true that the standards they received were different than what they ultimately voted on, and then he sent us the email, the documentation proof, and so I mean that's all we have to go off of right
and
now.
having said all that, then I'm assuming you're not going to take up a resolution to disapprove them.
You know, where things stand right now, it doesn't look likely. I mean, look, the pro tem has come out and said that it's not going to move forward. We've certainly had members digging into it and looking at it, but ultimately, when you look at the standards themselves, we didn't have consensus on items that we would want to revise or send back, at least not to this point. You know, we'll have a caucus meeting Monday, and if it comes up again, we can talk about it again. But as of right now, it does not appear to be the case.
Yeah, I think as of today, just to clarify for anybody watching, I'm not trying to be, not accurate. The handouts are posted for today's meeting now. I don't believe they were yesterday when I looked at the agenda. I could be wrong. I didn't
Okay.
take a screenshot, but they are posted as of now after the meeting.
Yeah.
Today's meeting is currently ongoing.
Yeah, well, and we've certainly had a lot of conversations about the board, right? We have House Bill 1491. We sent over to the Senate. I believe it was 80 to 16. It was really strong margins that said, if two board members want to put something on the agenda, they can do that. And so certainly that legislation is over in the Senate. And if they want to take it up, that would provide another option. If what you're telling me, and I haven't heard from the board members, but if what you're telling me is correct, and 3 of the board members want to reconsider something, then if the Senate were to pass House Bill 1491, send it to the governor's desk, then 3 board members would certainly be capable of putting an item on the agenda, at least for consideration. That doesn't mean it would pass. The board would have to discuss it, and a majority of them would have to vote for whatever action would be taken.
Now, that bill did not get a hearing inside the Senate Education Committee. I bumped into the pro tem just a little bit ago, asking him what goes on from here. Have you been able to talk to him about that process? And I'm a little taller. Can you actually look at Sean or somebody else right now, just so the eye level thing? But no, I just want to ask you though. Obviously, where's that at?
You're turning a little red. I don't know.
I'm embarrassed.
So we'll see. Obviously, today is the committee deadline. So bills move around from time to time in this building, and so if that bill were to do that, it would have the possibility of getting out of committee today. And if it does, then it's available for advancement. If it doesn't, that's certainly the prerogative of the Senate chairs, whether or not they're going to hear legislation. And I think it's a good bill, passed with broad margin of support. The governor, the pro tem, and I all put out support of that legislation. But we'll see what happens by the end of the day.
Another topic, I know wind energy setbacks have been a big conversation, and the House and Senate have very different versions. The Senate version is up for consideration on the House floor, and the House version is referred to an energy committee. Neither version has changed yet, so I'm curious, what are negotiations looking like working on a compromise?
Yeah, so where that stands currently, we had conversations with the Senate to do what we could to keep the bill alive in committee. And so you saw in Energy Committee and Chairman Archer's committee, I went and personally advocated to keep the bill alive and pass it in its current form as the Senate passed it. And then the Senate committed to us that they would give a hearing to House Bill 2751. So as far as the negotiations go, that's as far as the negotiations have went to do what we could to keep their Senate bill alive, and they would give our House bill a hearing, and then we'll see after the committee work wraps up at the end of the day, and continue conversations and hopefully get that important issue addressed and across the finish line. I still think language in 2751 is certainly better. This is an East and West issue in many ways. I don't want to oversimplify it, but in many ways it is, and so House Bill 2751 takes that into consideration. And there's also a lot more language in 2751 where it contemplates when certain projects would be grandfathered in and when they wouldn't be. That's not included in the Senate bill. and also the House bill goes from a residence versus the property line. And so there is a property line component, but it's based upon the height of the wind turbines. So I think our language that we have over in the House is really strong, and I'm glad that Chairman Green over in the Senate is giving it a hearing today, and I'm hopeful that it'll pass, but we'll be waiting to see what happens.
Some people have a concern that the House version functionally with the population density element, only applies to half or so of the state. Is that, what's the justification for that?
Sure. So one of the things that we do in that bill, in House Bill 2751, the very first section of the bill has language explaining the reason for the setbacks. Now, as you know, often it's not often in legislation that non-codified language like that is put into a bill, but we felt like it was important to explain our logic. And the logic is that if you go into more populated areas, that you're going to need a greater setback. Additionally, if your wind speed is lower, you're going to need a greater setback, because with a lower wind speed, you're going to need a taller wind turbine to be effective to capture the wind. And so that's really what we're looking at, because to try to have a one-size-fits-all approach, when really this probably should be regulated a little differently depending upon the population density and the wind speed of the area that you're in. That's why we did it. But it is a statewide bill, because ultimately there's a component of local control in House Bill 2751, where if folks in say Beaver County wanted to enact a greater setback than what they currently have, 2751 authorizes them to do that, whereas under current law they would have to have zoning in order to do that, whereas this bill just allows them to enact the setback. So I think it's good legislation, because it does consider the nuances that different parts of the state have different wind speed and different parts of the state have different population densities.
Something that has been asked for a minute, sports betting, it's in the Senate today. It's Representative Luttrell's bill, but in that is a very interesting thing about a legislative referendum. I don't know if you've talked to him about that, or Pro Tem Paxton about that legislative referendum, sports betting, but where are you at? Obviously, we've talked about sports betting before, but what about to the vote of the people?
Sure. So on this legislation, I think it's important. We have to work with our tribal partners if we're going to have the conversation about sportsbook. Now, when it comes, to gaming, that's something I'm not a big fan of gambling myself. But when you look at the sportsbook issue in question, Oklahomans, believe it or not, they are doing this already. They get a VPN and they're betting on sporting events. They're doing it. And so I think it's worthy of a conversation, since it's happening anyway. Should we figure out a way to put out the regulatory framework and do it in a way that makes sense, working with our tribal partners? And I believe the proposed solution from Representative Luttrell and Senator Coleman to potentially send it to a vote of the people makes sense, because we can say, hey, look, we'll let the voters decide on this important issue, which direction they want to go, if they want to do it or not, and then we'll know next year.
I apologize, I'm late. I have two questions, and they may have already been asked. One, what was your reaction today to the Senate moving on House Bill 2144? It was originally set to be killed in judiciary, but it was transferred to rules, and it came out of Rule 17.
2144 is?
The insurance bad faith bill passed the House 84 to zip by Representative Kennedy.
Yeah, I'd have to go. I hadn't had conversations with the Senate. I'm trying to pull the bill up here. It'd take me too long to do that, but I haven't had conversations with them about that. I didn't know any of the machinations of it moving around. That's news to me.
Okay. And secondly, what's the status? Is the legislature going to send back the standards for that DOE has sent over that allegedly were going to be approved, and now there's talk they're going to be shot down and sent back?
Sure. So we did have a lot of conversation about that earlier, and so I'll make sure Caroline gets you the link to earlier. I don't want to repeat the whole process, but one of the claims that was made earlier this week was that the board members received a packet that was different from what they ultimately voted on. And so the state superintendent, I had a conversation with him in person last night before an event, and he told me that is not true, and that he would send over documentation proving that that was not true. And so that's what I have here, is a copy of what the board members were sent and a copy of what they voted on. And as far as we can tell, they look identical, which again, these are lengthy documents, so we've looked at it as much as we can in 12 hours, but as far as we can tell, they appear to be similar. Now, we discussed there may be some other process concerns that have popped up, and if that's the case, those continue to need to be discussed, but at least on that particular issue, it appears that what they sent was identical from what we have been able to gather.
So it's likely that the House will still support those? What's the status?
I mean, it's likely, as of right now, it doesn't look like any HJR would be moving forward on our side, which again, if we were to do anything, it would need to be in concert with the state Senate. And, I wouldn't be a big fan of taking a vote just to take a vote. We need to be in concert with anything that we do. And our conversations amongst the chambers, it looks like the most likely path is not taking a vote on it right now. But, certainly that conversation could evolve next week as we get back in session. It's my understanding, I found out as this started, that the state board was actually meeting right now. So that may be far more interesting than what we're discussing today. And so who knows, maybe based on that discussion, that could influence decisions that we would make next week. But that's where things stand as of Thursday morning.
Wait, I do have one more question on that. Why not take a vote? One of the things you can do is approve them. So if you're confident in the process and you're confident in the contents, why not back it with a legislative vote?
So that would be abnormal. To my knowledge, the legislature's never taken a vote on standards of whether approving, disapproving, sending back, rescinding. And look, also, people of Oklahoma did vote Ryan Walters as state superintendent, so he was elected to be in charge of leading our public school system. And so a lot of times folks will criticize elected officials for not doing what they said they would do. I don't think at any point Ryan Walters has done things that he didn't say he was going to do when he campaigned. And so I think that's got to be a consideration as well. But and so if we were to take action again, it would need to be something in concert with the Senate, but it doesn't look like that at this time, but we'll continue to have conversations going into next week. And if something changes, we will certainly let you all know.
I have one other quick question, not on the topic, but I know you said there were a couple House priorities that did advance that you're excited about from the Senate. Are there any that have not, that you have noticed haven't moved out of the Senate committee? I know we saw today, but.
Well, we've talked about a couple of bills that I think are still pending a committee vote today, and so we'll see how those advance today or not. But truthfully, I have not been spending my days looking through Senate committee agendas to see what does and doesn't get heard. But we'll continue to have conversations. Look, one of the things, and I talk about this often, but particularly this week with it, Easter having been on Sunday, one of the sayings that Representative Clay Stairs mentioned at the town hall one time that I think is very relevant is, every day of April and May is Easter at the state capitol because there are resurrections every day. And so just because legislation may or may not get a hearing this week doesn't necessarily mean that topic is dead for the session. We'll continue to have conversations as it goes along and see where it wraps up. But again, a lot of the policy discussions are tied up into the budget conversations, and I know the Pro Tem and I, we've been having great conversations on how we land the plane on getting a final budget agreement. So thank you all for coming by. Appreciate it.